Fellas, I got good news. We're back with Tier 4 of the Doomsday Berg, and I'm really excited because we're starting to push away from the scary, grounded in reality and science stuff that made me look dumb, and we start to move into the more absurd, cult and just wild what-if stuff. And that's what I'm all about. Don't get me wrong, I've had fun researching everything and learning about these wild concepts. But here's where we get into the good stuff that I wanted to really talk about. And I also want to give a big thank you to Mighty Bull, the original creator of the Iceberg, who reached out to me and has been helping clarify and explain topics that I'm not 100% sure about. It's been really helpful, so go give him a follow on YouTube or Twitter, since they're a pretty cool dude. Go do that. And as always, I hope you got your snacks, you're comfortable, and don't have an existential crisis as we go a little deeper into this hootenanny. The moon leaving orbit is a pretty wild concept to me, especially since a lot of scientists say it is slowly drifting away from us. You may have noticed its longing gaze, newer haircut, brochure for Jupiter's orbit, or even the suitcase that's floating over Argentina. I think we messed up, fellas. But in all seriousness, if the moon were to leave Earth's orbit, it would have interesting effects, as at least if what I learned in middle school science is true, the moon is actually what keeps us in orbit in relation to the sun. So keeping with that logic, if the moon leaves, Earth would start to slowly drift into the sun. Not to mention the moon controls the waves, so the oceans would probably do some crazy wild stuff. And the worst thing out of all of it is the planet's seasons would be all out of whack, as the Earth's tilt caused by the moon is what causes them. So it's most likely that if the moon were to leave our orbit, hot boy summer as we know it would come to an end. And I think we all know that's the real tragedy. Cyborg Assimilation is actually one of the better things that could happen, if I'm being honest. You have your worst case scenario being something similar to the Borg from Star Trek, which is an alien hive mind cyborg race that looks to forcibly add all living beings to its collective as it searches for perfection. Which, yeah, that's absolutely terrifying. But this is one of those things that can actually be borderline good or even beneficial for humanity. Not the alien cyborg hive mind race, but the genetic augmentations and like cybernetic powers. I mean, just look at Cyberpunk and picture like all the great things that mankind can do with all those awesome augmentations. Just try to picture it without the evil corporations that rule the world. And ignore the fact that we're slowly heading that way. I love my internet overlords. So the Nemesis Star is a theorized brown dwarf star that some think orbits about 1.5 light years away from our solar system. And a group of paleontologists and astronomers theorize it caused many of Earth's mass extinctions, with a gap between them being roughly 26 million years or so. The obvious theory is that the star will circle back to Earth and cause another mass extinction. However, the star itself has never been found, so yeah, not a lot to do about that one. It's probably not real. The next thing we have is an electromagnetic pulse, or EMP for short. This one is actually kind of something to be concerned about. Not only can it occur in nature with smaller forms like lightning hitting a grid and your power going out, but it can also happen in bigger instances like a solar flare, which can be as harmless as the aurora borealis, or as dangerous as messing with the Earth's magnetosphere. I don't know what that is, but it sounds like something that shouldn't be messed with. And the thing that is really concerning about EMPs is that mankind has managed to weaponize them. So we could use them on each other, and its use on any country that heavily depends on modern technology would massively cripple their infrastructure in everyday life, as it wouldn't just take out small things like your TV or your cell phone and refrigerators, but massive things like city power grids, water systems, basic medical equipment, airlines, and even cars that are newer than like 1985, 1990. The best example I can give to like kind of show like a real world idea is think back to Modern Warfare 2 when Captain Price detonates the ballistic missile in the upper atmosphere over DC, and the entire eastern seaboard of the United States loses power. and you get to see everything from helicopters to radios to even your holographic sight losing power. I also remember reading a book a few years back called 1 Second After about an EMP attack on the US and how it affected a small town in North Carolina, and how they lost all their modern amenities over the last 100 years, showing just how dependent we are on them. I remember it being pretty good, but I also read it when I was like a sophomore in high school, so I might be wrong. Environmental toxins are a thing. Weirdly enough, I couldn't find anything on them, and I don't want to bother Boole to explain another entry. My guess is think things like greenhouse gases. Now the Palma Megatsunami, it's kind of disturbing, a little bit. It's a theory that the island of La Palma, just off the coast of East Africa, will erupt and cause a landslide, which will in turn result in a massive tsunami with initial waves at about 1.5 miles high, and then they'll eventually gradually decrease to around 100 feet in size. And I know what you're thinking, that doesn't sound that bad, until you look at the projected path of the waves, which would stretch clear across the Atlantic Ocean, going as far north as the United Kingdom, and as far east as to reach the United States, covering everything from New York to Florida, as well as northern South American countries like Venezuela and Guyana, and potentially not dying down until it reaches the Gulf of Mexico. Not to mention, like I said, the island of La Palma itself is only about 300 miles off the coast of Morocco, and 800 miles from Portugal. The waves would also reach them. So this one little rock having a violent fit could single-handedly devastate 4 continents. And you know how I said that it's projected the waves would steadily decrease to be about 100 feet in size? Yeah, they wouldn't reach that height until they got to the Florida coast, which is about 3,700 miles away from La Palma. So North and South America would actually get the best case scenario in that, aside from the areas of the world that wouldn't be affected at all. And we're moving on because I don't like talking about large pools of water. I'm bad at swimming and I don't like being in it when I can't touch the ground. So moving on to a slightly better topic, magnetic field shifts actually kind of play into EMPs, at least on a solar scale. As I'm sure you know, the Earth has poles like north and south. They're magnetic, which is why compass point north. And if they were to shift, to put it simply, a compass would point south instead of north. Which doesn't sound too bad, just navigation tools would be a little wonky for a while. However, while the poles are shifting, up to 8 poles can actually develop and begin to fight over which will stay. And while doing so, our magnetosphere, that thing I mentioned we shouldn't, mess with, would actually significantly weaken, making our planet far more susceptible to harmful things from space like radiation, space dust, and the like, meaning we'd all die a slow and painful death from space. This is getting fun. It's wow, that got kind of dark, so let's lighten the mood with some good old mass insanity. Often known as mass hysteria, it happens when some form of illness, whether it be a mental or physical issue, spreads through a large population for no apparent reason or actual cause of the outbreak. And these instances can range from an actual psychological or at the very least understandable explanation to extremely bizarre events that just make you question everything. I think the best example I can give for this is think that M. Night Shyamalan movie about the planets that make people take the big sleep. And this is actually something I want to do a more in-depth video on, so for now, I'm just going to share a few cases of it happening. One of the first documented incidents was dancing mania. It was widespread throughout Europe between the 14th and 17th century, in which large groups of people, sometimes reaching up to the thousands, would start dancing in the streets for days on end until they collapsed from exhaustion for no apparent reason. They kind of think they know what caused this, but it's also not 100% sure. Another instance was the 1938 Halifax slasher incident in Halifax, England, where people started claiming to be attacked by a madman wielding a mallet and a knife, with 11 report incidents of violence, 2 of which actually being innocent men attacked by vigilante mobs, One of those mobs was full of drunk hooligans. Reported attacks also began popping up in Manchester, Bradford, and London, but there never was a madman running around with a mallet and knife. The first two women that reported the incident admitted it was all a hoax, and overall this entire thing happened for about a week until their confession. In 1962, you had the Tanganyika laughter epidemic, which occurred in what is now modern-day Tanzania. It started when 3 schoolgirls just randomly started giggling and couldn't stop. It eventually spread to over half the students. And after the school finally shut down and sent the kids home, it spread to the surrounding villages. By the end of the incident, approximately 18 months later, 14 schools in total had shut down, and around 1,000 people had been inflicted. Weirdly enough, most of those inflicted were young girls between the ages of 12 and 18. And lastly, in 2002, you had the cheerleader seizures in North Carolina, where 10 girls and 1 boy at a rural high school began having seizures, which then began to spread, with 2 outliers being the 1 boy who was diagnosed with epilepsy after a car accident, and 1 of the girls who had seizures as a child. And the really weird thing about this one is that all of those initially inflicted either were currently cheerleaders or former cheerleaders. Why it happened to cheerleaders? No one really knows aside from just being around each other. Up next is Ragnarök. No, not the Marvel movie, the actual Norse predictions for the end of times. And it's actually really complicated to try and read. I tried to read a few articles and passages from it, and my brain began to hurt. And it didn't help that there were a lot of Scandinavian words that I didn't understand or know how to pronounce because I don't speak Scandinavian. But thankfully, Simply English Wikipedia exists, and it simplifies everything so dum-dums like me can understand it. As I said, it's the Norse prediction for the end of the world, and it is said Odin will lead the gods to war against an army led by Loki and Surtur. I think I said that right. The long and short of it is, a lot of gods are said to die, many planets will be destroyed, including Asgard. But ultimately, the gods will win, and some kind of life will begin anew, even though I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce the name you see on the screen. It is said to have survived and be the last form of evil in the world. Peace will be achieved in the end, and life will begin anew. So kind of a happy ending there, which is always nice. And our last topic of the day, we have the solidifying of Earth's core. I'm sure you may have heard, the Earth's core is very hot and full of liquid hot magma. I know, it's a wild concept. But what we may not know is, what happens when that liquid hot magma cools down and no longer becomes that? Well, the answer is actually kind of complicated. If the core solidifies, then it means our planet would get cold and die. There is also a good chance we'll lose our magnetic field, which is what protects us from cosmic radiation. So we'd all freeze to death, or die from space radiation also. It really all depends on what gets us first, the coal or space. Either way, if it does happen, you'd be assured it won't be a very fun time. But you also have to remember that this is based on if you believe the core is in fact full of magma, which we all know is completely false. The Earth is not only hollow, but home to both the lizard people and hyper-intelligent gorillas, who are at war over not only who should control Gartha, but who has the rights to come to the surface and take over all of mankind. And thankfully, as of late, the gorillas are on the come up and are not only fighting back, but winning against the lizard people, which we all know is a good thing because...
I don't need a hit from you no more. I got no